Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Dave Muir, and I'm going to be your teacher for this section of general biology, the second semester of general biology, Bio 1202. And I do apologize that both of your classes this week are going to be asynchronous and recorded, but I'm a little bit under the weather. And as given the times, this isn't something to fool around with. And so I'm staying inside until I'm completely well. But it doesn't stop me from being able to record a class for you. So in today's class, this may be a repeat for some of you. Some of you may have finished off with this, with an introduction to this section at the end of last semester. That's fine. I do want to just say one thing. I'm going to jump straight into this, into the class material, and I will wait until I meet with you on Monday to discuss all of the class regulations and the rules and everything else. I'd rather do that face to face. But in the meantime, we can get on with this section, even if you may have seen it before, or some of it before. So today we're going to discuss very briefly the history of life on Earth. We could spend a whole semester talking about it, as is the case with so many of our topics in biology. But we're going to very briefly just run through some of the principles that attach to our understanding of the history of life on Earth. And in doing so, what we are discussing, what we refer to as macroevolutionary processes. Macroevolutionary is the broad pattern of evolution above the species level. When you talk about things like Darwin's finches evolving on the Galapagos and that sort of thing, those we refer to as microevolutionary processes. And that it's from basically how species evolve within a genus, say, or how species differentiate from one another. Macroevolution refers to major changes over a very long period of time. Macroevolutionary processes are those which led from the single-celled organisms becoming multicellular, multicellular organisms becoming animals, multi-tissued, etc., developing backwards. All of these are macroevolutionary processes, and they take place over a very long period of time. So there are many of the things processes which we observe have led to the huge diversity of living things. But we need to remember that all living things are united in that we all share a common ancestor. And these macroevolutionary processes, although they have led to huge diversity, nonetheless, evolution always works on some existing structure or system and elaborates it. So even though these macroevolutionary processes look like they've led to huge differences in groups, remember these groups are still united by having common ancestry. So how do we know that this is the case? Well, in this diagram here needs some careful examination, because it actually explains to you much of what we are going to discuss in the rest of this class. First of all, a major part of our understanding about macroevolutionary processes and about the history of life on Earth and how those processes have taken place lie in the fact that we have a fossil record. Fossils are the remains of once living organisms. They are preserved in various ways. The commonest way in which fossils are preserved is in sedimentary rock. And in sedimentary rock, there's a couple of principles that we need to recognize. First of all, if we look at rock strata and layers of sediment as they have been laid down through time, the older strata lie at the bottom, and the younger strata are up at the top. Now, we in some places have very, very deep layers of sedimentary rock. Think, for example, of the Grand Canyon, which spans eons. And if we look through all of those strata, we can find preserved in them fossils, which are representative of the living organisms that were present when that stratum was being laid down. So we can assume that the fossils down here are older than fossils up here. And if we look, in many cases, if we look at the fossils as we proceed up to the younger strata, what we see, first of all, that fossils here at the bottom are very, very different to the fossils which are at the top. But if we move gradually through these strata, we find that the differences accumulate slowly. The differences between this stratum here and this one here are not nearly as great as the differences between this stratum here and this stratum here. These evolutionary processes work very slowly. These sediments are laid down extremely slowly. And what we're looking at when we see a system like this, what we're looking at is an enormous span of time. So these processes take place over a long period of time. Remembering that we are somewhere in the origins of the planet, we have a common ancestor. We can relate what we know about the development of evolutionary structures in these strata. And we can see several principles in operation. First of all, here's our common ancestor there. This common ancestor diverged. It diverged into different populations. The reasons why those divergences take place can be very complex. We'll mention three in particular in a minute. One of the lessons we learn looking at a fossil record, however, is first of all that fossils are rather rare. Not everything gets fossilized. Second of all, many evolutionary lineages, even very, very successful evolutionary lineages, become extinct. They end, and they appear to produce no progenitors. So evolution is a mixture. It's a mixture of development of lineages and extinction of lineages, and we can trace those as we look through the fossil record. So there are three things which, over very long periods of time, there are three things which drive these evolutionary processes in particular. The first is that the Earth is not static. The surface of the Earth changes shape. The continents bind together, break up. The continents actually move around the surface of the Earth. As they do so, they carry with them populations. They carry with them populations of plants and animals and everything else. And those are slowly exposed to different climates, to different conditions. They are kept isolated from one another for a certain amount of time, then get together and populations are forced to interact. These are very powerful evolutionary drives which may result in diversity. The second thing which we observe, if we look through the fossil record, is that there are many times when there is a sudden and abrupt change in the populations. And these changes are often accompanied by mass extinctions. Suddenly, whole lines of organisms, even very successful ones, suddenly go completely extinct. And what happens is that only a few actually survive. So have a look here. This is just theoretical. But here is a system rising from the common ancestor, has led to very, very diverse lines of organisms here and here. A mass extinction event has occurred. Those can be for various reasons, which we'll talk about in a minute. Most of those organisms are rendered extinct, and only a few survive. Those few that survive are tremendously important because they survive into a world which is entirely different now that all of these have been removed. So they can actually begin to radiate out. They begin to radiate out into all of those ecological niches, for example, which are now free because of the mass extinction. So these are the three major processes that we see driving macroevolution. The first is continental drift, these huge geological changes. The second, processes of mass extinction. We know of at least 5 in the history of the world. The third is adaptive radiation, the sudden and explosive evolution of new groups from ancestors which have remained after a mass extinction, for example, or which have inhabited an entirely uninhabited area, like an island or whatever. These are the processes of adaptive radiation. So remember those 3: continental drift, mass extinction, and adaptive radiation, the major drivers of macroevolution. So let's just think for a minute about the history of our planet, what we know of it. I obviously realize that there's a huge amount that we don't know. But we believe that the Earth formed in its initial form about 4.6 billion years ago. It coalesced out of a cloud of ash, dust, and gases, which surrounded the sun as a disk. And it slowly accreted together as gravity pulled the particles together. For a very long time, it was bombarded by meteorites, by material flying in from space. And it was rather a loose accretion of particles smacking into one another continuously. Those collisions all generated heat. So then, and the initial Earth became molten. It was far too hot for liquid water to exist. And liquid water is a prerequisite for life. So until liquid water could occur on the planet, life itself could not evolve. But actually quite rather rapidly, by about 4 billion years ago, the Earth had cooled enough that all the water vapor which had been driven into the atmosphere by the heat could begin to condense and rain out. And the longest rainstorm in the history of the Earth began to last several million years to produce the primitive oceans. The primitive oceans were rather hot. They were very, very rich in dissolved gases and things like that. But there was not yet any sign of life. The second thing about that early Earth is that it was completely anoxic. It had no oxygen, free oxygen. There was plenty of oxygen, but the oxygen was all tied up, bound to minerals like iron, things like that. There were, however, a lot of primitive organic compounds, such as methane, and other precursors of organic molecules like nitrogen and ammonia, these sorts of things, which had arisen by purely chemical processes, not through life processes, but by purely chemical processes. Now that primitive atmosphere, very rich in things like sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, this what we refer to as a reducing atmosphere. There's no free oxygen. And if we look experimentally at an atmosphere like that, as these workers, Miller and Urey, did in the 1950s, Miller and Urey believed that that primitive reducing atmosphere, if it was subjected to tremendous energies, as for example from lightning bolts, this was their main theory, was the lightning bolts were able to generate the precursors of organic materials and simple organic compounds. So this is what they did. They created a primitive atmosphere enclosed in a flask. They subjected it to an electric spark over a long period of time. And they began to collect anything that condensed out of this. And what they found were simple organic compounds, simple amino acids, things like this. Thus demonstrating that even if this is not the exact mechanism whereby this occurred, it certainly is possible to generate organic compounds necessary for life from inorganic compounds. which are present in the primitive atmosphere. So the theory goes that these primitive molecules eventually ended up becoming so abundant that they formed a sort of a soup. The seas became very rich in these simple organic compounds. And these organic compounds then, by purely chemical, physicochemical processes, not life processes, but physicochemical processes, began to come together to form macromolecules. The circumstances under which this could occur is not absolutely clear. Various things have been posited, but one thing appears to be really important, and that is the presence of substances like clays, which can accrete these molecules together and facilitate the formation of macromolecules. The next step was that these somehow had to be enclosed within a membrane, within what we refer to as protocells. A protocell is a membrane enclosed area, does not have the properties of life. It has some of the features of life. For example, if we form a sphere with a membrane around it, the membrane around that sphere allows the inside of the sphere to be different, the conditions inside to be different to the outside. We can make these little spheres, which we call protocells. We can do it experimentally. And they have some of the properties of life. For example, they can increase in size without diluting the interior. So they increase in size but accumulate material as they do it. And when they reach a certain size, they are able to physically separate into two. So this is not a living process yet, but it is awfully suggestive of the way in which the membranes around cells actually operate. That a membrane, especially a phospholipid membrane, is able to maintain conditions on the inside which are different to those on the outside. But this is a long way away from a living cell. And the living cell has to be able to replicate. It has to be able to replicate, and it has to be able to accumulate information about life process and transmit that information to its progeny. That is a huge step. We believe that the first molecules to do that, the first self-replicating molecules, were in fact not DNA, but were RNA, ribonucleic acid. And the reason we believe that is because ribonucleic acid, first of all, there are many kinds of ribonucleic acid. There are many kinds of ribonucleic acid with different functions inside our own cells. But they have one characteristic which sets them apart, and that is that they are able to act as enzymes. RNA can act as an enzyme. It can act as an enzyme which governs its own processes. We believe that RNA was the precursor molecule. The DNA actually evolved from RNA through a very complex set of circumstances. Now, the place where these kind of processes can take place, as I told you, we don't know absolutely clearly. Various places have been proposed. Tide pools, for example, volcanic ponds, like you'd see it at Yellowstone or somewhere like that. And a very good candidate are hydrothermal vents. These areas on the ocean floor where very hot, mineral-rich water erupts from the seabed and forms whole ecosystems on the ocean floor. This is one area which is very likely to have featured importantly in the formation of these early protocells and their function. There's another intriguing aspect to this. Remember, I told you the early Earth was bombarded by meteorites. It was bombarded by particles coming in from outside. We've discovered that even meteorites arriving on Earth nowadays, modern times, actually contain primitive, simple organic compounds like amino acids. They contain lipids. They contain simple sugars. They even contain nitrogenous bases. Remember the function of nitrogenous bases in things like ATP and in DNA and RNA. And we find these here, for example, this is a very famous meteorite called the Murchison meteorite from Australia. And it, when they examined it, they found all of these things present in the rock of meteorite. And similar things have been found in other rocky meteorites as well. So this could also have been a source of those organic molecules, quite apart from the physicochemical processes, lightning or whatever in the early Earth. Okay, so we're going to have just a brief look at fossils and at the fossil record. And realizing the tremendous importance of the fossil record in giving us an idea of how developments took place in different organisms over time. Now, the vast majority of fossils are found in sedimentary rock, as I've told you. There are some other kinds of fossils, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. But the fossils laid down in sedimentary rock are particularly useful because of the timeline that they give us. And as you'll see in a minute, in many cases, we can actually date different strata. So here are some of the different kinds of fossils. This is a plant fossil. This is an impression fossil. What has happened is a plant here has been sandwiched in sediment, and all its organic matter has been replaced by carbon. So what you have is a carbon print, essentially, of the fossil. In other cases, of course, entire bone may be fossilized, and very often those, particularly in the older fossils, the original material, the original mineral material is replaced by silicate materials, but in the exact shape of the original organism or whatever remains of that organism. Here is a petrified tree. Petrified trees, that's the exact process that is taking place. All of the organic material of the tree of the plant has been replaced by silicate materials. There are other fossils which we refer to as trace fossils, which can also give very useful information. For example, here are footprints, dinosaur footprints in Colorado. There are other kinds of trace fossils, burrows, these sorts of things. This here is a fossil, still regarded as being a fossil. It's a fossil from the permafrost in the Yukon in Canada. Animals which died in Arctic areas were very frequently deep frozen and incorporated into the substrate, into the permafrost. Mammoths, wolves, dire wolves, all sorts of animals which are now extinct periodically are discovered in the permafrost, particularly nowadays, unfortunately, because of global warming. In many areas, the permafrost is thawing and revealing these organisms. This is another kind of fossil that you've probably heard of if you've ever watched Jurassic Park. This is a mosquito embedded in amber. Amber is sap, is fossilized sap of trees. And it very frequently incorporates insects because insects are attracted to the tree sap. They try to feed on it, they get stuck in it, and they get incorporated and then fossilized. So these are all different kinds of fossils. Any of these can provide us with really useful information. I would also point out that in modern times, fossils can actually provide another source of information, quite apart from the way they look, the morphology, etc., etc. Something like the wolf pup, shown here, which has been incorporated into the permafrost, may well yield DNA information. You may well be able to sequence this DNA and extract information that way as well. Okay, so these the fossils and the strata that are associated with them can be dated by various means. First of all, in the old days, they dated by trying to work out how rapidly sedimentation occurred and how rapidly would different strata have been laid down. That is one way to try and date the strata, is by their depth and by their relationship to one another. That is not a particularly accurate way of doing it. It's somewhat subjective, of course. In the 20th century and now and onwards, instead, radiometric dating is much more important. And radiometric dating looks at the decay of radioisotopes which are incorporated into the strata. And it looks also sometimes at the ratios of different radioisotopes to one another. The one that most people have heard about, and which is illustrative of some of the principles, is carbon-14. Now, normally, most carbon, the carbon in our bones and everything, is carbon-12. And that's stable. It doesn't break down at all. Carbon-14 is continuously formed. It is continuously expelled into, accumulated in the atmosphere, largely by the impact of solar radiation in the upper atmosphere, which changes carbon-12 in carbon dioxide to carbon-14. And it is a constant. It breaks down at a constant rate, and it is made at a constant rate. So its proportion in the atmosphere is relatively constant. And all living things, as they live and exchange carbon continuously with the environment, they maintain the same level, the same ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in their tissues. As soon as something dies, that exchange stops. So if you go to plant material, for example, which has been dead for a long time, or bone, or whatever, you can now look and see what is the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in those bones. Because as soon as they stopped accumulating carbon-14 from the environment, the amount of carbon-14 began to decrease. Now, any radioisotope has a half-life. That is, it has a certain set time where half of it will have decayed to another isotope. And in the case of carbon-14, the half-life is about 5,730 years. In actual fact, carbon-14 is only useful for measuring up to tens of thousands of years, not hundreds or millions of years. But the same kind of principle applies to other isotopes, and there are other isotopes which we can use to date for millions of years. And these are the ones which are used to date rock strata, for example, particularly if the rock strata incorporate volcanic material which originates from the center of the Earth, obviously. Then that can be used for other isotopes. So there are some problems with this fossil record. It gives us a tremendous amount of information. First of all, we know that the past organisms very often very different to those living today, although we can, if we look at the fossil record carefully, we can see relationships between them. The second thing, the fossil record often terminates for whole groups because of the prevalence of extinction in the fossil record. Many organisms that were once extremely common, even dominant, became extinct. But we can see that new groups arise once that process, those are the processes of mass extinction and of adaptive radiation. But this is the problem with this fossil record. The first is if an organism exists for a very long time, it's much more likely to have been fossilized. Fossilization is an extremely rare occurrence. A vanishingly small proportion of organisms that are alive at any one time will actually become fossilized, successfully fossilized. So the longer an organism is present on the planet, the more likelihood is we'll have a fossil of it somewhere. In addition, rare organisms, which may be tremendously important in evolutionary processes, rare organisms stand very little chance of being fossilized, just because they're not present, just because they're present in such small numbers. The third thing is the likelihood of being fossilized is enormously increased if you have hard parts, like an exoskeleton or a bony skeleton or teeth or something like this. But many very important organisms don't have any of that. There are many invertebrates which have been extremely important in evolution, in macroevolution, of which we have virtually no record at all. Soft parts seldom fossilized, except under very, very special circumstances. So nonetheless, given all the caveats of the fossil record, we use the fossil record to establish some idea about geological time. And geological time is tremendously long. It's hard for us to conceive of the enormous span of time that lies between the formation of the Earth, for example, and us on up in present day. But here is, I don't expect you to remember all of the details of this, but but you can have a look. For the moment, notice that we divide the fossil record and geological time into, first of all, into eons. And the eons are called the Hadean. The Hadean was the period of formation of the planet, the consolidation of the planet, the formation of the early oceans, and the very beginnings of the origin of life took place towards the end of the Hadean. The next eon is the Proterozoic. This Proterozoic means start of life. This is when the first primitive groups were established. Many of the groups established here, however, are now extinct and seem to have been evolutionary dead ends. The next eon, sorry, that's the Archean, not the Proterozoic, I'm sorry. I left out the Archean. The Archean is a period where we had the establishment of a true life, largely prokaryotic, but leading eventually to multicellular organisms. The Proterozoic is the era of primitive life. This is where the animal groups, for example, are first established. Subsequent to that, we have this eon here called the Phanerozoic. And the Phanerozoic is this entire span of time right up to the present, when these primitive groups here exploded out. Macroevolutionary processes here went absolutely crazy and led to the development of most of the groups that we see today. Now, those eons are divided again into eras. Here, I just want to try and move something. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to move something out of the way because it's sitting in front of my diagram. So the eons are divided into these eras, and the ones that I want you to remember, and just know that you know them, are the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. The Cenozoic is the most recent. The reason why I want you to remember these is because each of these eras here, their boundaries are determined by mass extinctions. which take place and which absolutely decimate entire huge groups which have arisen during these eras. These are tremendously important events. Sometimes they wipe out 50, 60% of extent of the species all at once. And we'll talk about them again in a little while. Our current period is Quaternary, and the Quaternary is divided into these epochs, and we are living in the Holocene epoch. I don't expect you to remember all of the rest of these, but you can look them up and see. Each of these periods here are distinguished by a dominance of some particular group, which appears in the fossil record as tremendously important. I'll just give you some quick. The Cambrian, for example, all of a sudden there's an explosion of invertebrate forms. The Devonian is also called the age of the fishes because this is when most of the fish groups evolved. The Permian is a period when which is dominated in vertebrate forms by a group called the mammal-like reptiles. Here, these, of course, you all know, the Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous. This is the Mesozoic, also called the age of the reptiles. This is when the reptiles were dominant, and when, in particular, towards at the end here, this here is the mass extinction, which led to the loss of the dinosaurs. Subsequent to that, the Cenozoic is also called the age of the mammals, because this is when, once the dinosaurs had been rendered extinct, the mammals exploded out. So this is how we begin to relate these different times to one another. We recognize characteristics within the fossil record, and as we look through here, we also see the development of macroevolutionary trends. So there are various ways to think about this. It's very difficult to conceive of the enormous time span. So there are various ways that we can try and do it. This is a common way to do it, is to look at a clock, at a stopwatch rather. And the stopwatch, the watch has 60 minutes on it here. And if we look at the passage of time, then here's the origin of the planet. The prokaryotes arise here at about 9 o'clock. The atmosphere remains completely free of oxygen until about here, when photosynthesis evolves around about here, about 25 minutes rather. Eukaryotes, the simple eukaryotes, for about 35 minutes. Multicellular eukaryotes, about 45 minutes. Animals at about 50 minutes, etc., etc. And then humans in the last couple of minutes. There's another way to think about this. If we were to look at New York, okay, and you were to walk from the Bronx all the way to the college, you would start on your journey. And you start walking. You're going to walk through the Bronx. You're going to walk through Harlem. You're going to walk and you walk and walk and walk and you walk, and you're going to end up at about 100 and something street in Central Park, when the prokaryotes evolve. You're going to carry on, and you're going to carry on, you're going to carry on walking, and you're going to end up around about at the village when single cell eukaryotes evolve. Then you're going to walk and walk and walk and walk, and you're going to end up Brooklyn Bridge around about when colonization took place, of land took place. All of this time, all of that time there's very little up on land. There's some primitive organisms up on land, but the true colonization of land only took place here. So here you are, this is Brooklyn Bridge, right? So now you're going to walk to the college, and human beings evolved as you're standing in the doorway of the classroom. So that gives you an idea. This is a huge span of time, and we have only existed for a minute blip, but we've had an enormous impact on our planet. Okay, so let's have a look at some of the actual organisms. The very first true living organisms to evolve were prokaryotes. Now remind yourselves about what characterized a prokaryote. A prokaryote has only got a cell membrane around the cytoplasm, and they have the DNA is not bound into a nucleus. It is inside the cytoplasm, but unbound by a nucleus. But within the prokaryotes, all of the physiological processes that characterize living things on Earth have their origin. So we can, although we think about prokaryotes as being primitive or simple, simply because they consist of a single cell, they are far from simple. And these, just let me get back to here, incorporated in here is the evolution of an enormous range of metabolic processes, which led to the formation of the early prokaryotes. So these early prokaryotes, we have, this says 3.5, we actually have older ones dating from about 3.85 billion years. These prokaryotes were best preserved when they formed these structures called stromatolites. And stromatolites are accumulations of layers of prokaryotes with sediments. And these are actually stromatolites which occur in Australia and in South Africa. And they slowly build up layer by layer by layer, layers of prokaryotes, then sediment. The sediment obscures the prokaryotes, and they tend to move to the outside as they reproduce and accumulate more sediment, and so on and so on and so on. And these are very easily fossilized. And you may have heard of the term dolomite. Dolomite is actually a limestone, and it's much of the dolomite present on the planet is actually formed from these fossilized stromatolites. So for the first 1.5 billion years, the only things which are present on the planet were prokaryotes, but they occasioned two of the great life revolutions that took place. The first was simply by their formation, because these were living organisms. They conformed completely to our definitions of life. They reproduced, they handed on information to progeny. They handed it on via nucleic acids, and the true prokaryotes were based on DNA. That's the first thing. But the first groups of prokaryotes which evolved were heterotrophic. They were making use of all of those accumulated organic compounds which were present in the primordial seas, which had arisen from physical chemical processes, not through life processes, but they had accumulated to form a thick soup of organic materials. Once the prokaryotes evolved, they could live heterotrophically on those compounds, but they began to use them up. And this led to the first great problem in life, was that they had no source of new organic matter. So as they proceed through their metabolism, what are they doing? They're accessing organic matter not only to build their biomolecules, but also for energy. And every time they access it for energy, they're going to waste some. They're going to reduce the organic compounds to carbon dioxide and water. And the energy ultimately is lost as heat and radiated out to space. So now here comes a huge crisis for living things. Where are they going to start getting organic compounds from when they've used up all of the organic compounds that were accumulated in the early earth, in the early seas? Well, the answer came when a group of prokaryotes evolved the processes of photosynthesis. And those prokaryotes were primitive cyanobacteria, which were able to take carbon dioxide and water, use the sun's energy, put them together into new organic compounds, which now became available and could enter all of the ecological processes and be used by others. So in a way, this was the first great revolution, was the ability to actually take simple things, simple molecules, carbon dioxide and water, put them together in an autotrophic process, so that not only the autotrophs, but also the heterotrophs could now have a source of organic molecules and energy. That's the first thing. But the second thing is that when they did this process of photosynthesis, this process of what we refer to as plant photosynthesis, which evolved in the cyanobacteria, it had a byproduct, and the byproduct was oxygen. Now, oxygen is a very dangerous molecule. Biologically, it's very undesirable to have free oxygen floating around. And the reason for that is that it's a very, very reactive molecule. It's extremely electronegative. And it oxidizes compounds, especially biological compounds. It oxidizes and damages biological molecules. And this led to a great crisis. First of all, the crisis was some time in coming, because as the cyanobacteria produced oxygen and it began to accumulate in the atmosphere and in the water, there was a huge amount of ions, particularly metal ions, such as iron, which could bind to that oxygen and remove it. So, for example, in the seas, iron oxide began to form, rust, and it sopped up all of the oxygen, and oxygen actually couldn't really accumulate to any great degree for many millions of years. But it rained out to form these kind of sediments. These are this is called banded iron oxide, and this is, you can see the red bands here. This is essentially rust, primordial rust, which has fallen out as the iron bound to the oxygen released by the cyanobacteria. But there's a limit to this. Eventually, oxygen began to accumulate. It began to free oxygen began to accumulate in the water and in the atmosphere. And this was tremendously dangerous. And it led to the first great extinction, the first great mass extinction. And this was a mass extinction of most of the prokaryotes, of the heterotrophic prokaryotes, which had arisen in the Hadean and the early Archean. And the reason that they died was they simply were unable to withstand the presence of oxygen in either in the water or in the atmosphere. And some of them resorted to retreating to anaerobic environments. And we still, if we look at prokaryotes today, we still have many prokaryotes which survive perfectly well in totally anaerobic environments. And they are like reminders of the early kinds of prokaryotes that were present on the planet. But most of them simply died out in the presence of oxygen. But at the same time, there was another process beginning to evolve. And this is the process of respiration, of cellular respiration. And we believe that cellular respiration originally evolved as a way of dealing with the presence of free oxygen in the atmosphere or in the water. So what organisms did was they took that free oxygen and they combined it with organic compounds, and they produce carbon dioxide, which is, compared to oxygen, is much less dangerous. So they produce carbon dioxide, they produce water from some organic compounds and the oxygen that was being accumulated. And from that original protective process, the process of cellular respiration to produce energy actually began to evolve. And we now had these groups of organisms, some of them autotrophic, some of them heterotrophic, which were able to survive in an oxygen-rich environment, and at the same time had access to this very, very efficient way of producing energy, producing cellular energy. Okay, so here we are here. This is where we've arrived. About 25 minutes here is where the atmospheric oxygen is now beginning to accumulate. Here is the point at which single-celled eukaryotes began to evolve from the prokaryotes. And we believe that those primitive eukaryotes arose from a process of endosymbiosis. That is the prokaryotic cell, which just had a membrane, a simple membrane. There was some primitive eukaryote cell, which was essentially like a prokaryote, which took in other prokaryotes. It incorporated other prokaryotes in its cytoplasm. The most important ones that we still recognize are, first of all, other prokaryotes which were able to serve as a source of cellular energy. That's the first. The second were those which were prokaryotes which were actually able to perform the process of photosynthesis. So what we picture this. There are two groups that are particularly important. The one group incorporated only those prokaryotes which were able to produce cellular energy. We recognize that endosymbiont now as the mitochondrion. Another group were able to take in both those, what would form the mitochondria, and autotrophic prokaryotes, which were able to do photosynthesis. And those formed the chloroplasts in the eukaryotic cell. So this complex process of endosymbiosis is, we believe, what led to the origins of the eukaryotes. And there are various reasons why we think that this is actually true. But if you look at if you look at a eukaryotic cell and you look at its mitochondria, the mitochondria have certain characteristics. First of all, the mitochondria have their own DNA, and their DNA is in the form of a little circle of DNA, just like the prokaryotes. Second of all, the mitochondria are enclosed in a double membrane. The mitochondrial matrix, rather, is enclosed by a set of double membranes. You look at the outer membrane, it looks like a eukaryote membrane. It looks much like the cell membrane. If you look at the inner membrane, it actually has characteristics of prokaryote. Prokaryote membranes are slightly different to eukaryote membranes. And here in the mitochondria, we have preserved like a fossil record of the original prokaryotes. The same for chloroplasts. Chloroplasts also have their own DNA in the form of a circle, and they also have prokaryote characteristics. So we believe that this was indeed the process whereby the first eukaryotes were produced. The next step, let me see if we can go here. This is the formation. We've got to the formation of the single-cell eukaryote. Now the next major macroevolutionary step was the formation of multicellular eukaryotes, ultimately both plants and animals. But initially, probably the plants were the first. And the first, in fact, the first multicellular eukaryotes may well have been primitive plants or algae. Here, for example, this is in the Archean, and this is actually a red alga, and it is fully multicellular. It, in fact, is, if you look at it microscopically, is quite, it's fairly complex multicellular organism, but it's a red alga. This here is one of the very first of the primitive multicellular animals, and they formed right here in the Proterozoic, in the Proterozoic era, and in fact the first of them. Here's one here. It's very rare in the fossil record because they were probably entirely soft. We believe that they were flat, floating forms. We have no idea about how they actually functioned. It may well be that they depended on endosymbiotic prokaryotes or something like this. And these are called the Ediacaran Fauna. And they all appear to have been flattened, floating forms, rather maybe like jellies, something like that. But they died out absolutely and completely without a trace at the end of the Ediacaran. Now, in this period here, before this major change into the Cambrian, at the end of the Ediacaran here, there began a radiation of different animal forms. Just the roots, not an explosion, but we begin to see the first of the true invertebrate groups that we even recognize today. This is towards the end of the Ediacaran. That evolution appears to have wiped out the Ediacaran fauna. And suddenly here in the Cambrian, in this incredible period here called the Cambrian, these invertebrate forms suddenly exploded in a worldwide period of incredible adaptive radiation. They exploded into many, many, many different wild, almost inconceivable different forms. And this is, it's so sudden, this change here, from Ediacaran to Cambrian, is so sudden that we refer to it as the Cambrian Explosion. And we see in the fossil record suddenly becomes full of fossils, sponges, jellies, mud, mollusks, all sorts of strange arthropods, even chinosins and precursors to our own group, the chordates, suddenly appear apparently within a few million years, which is a flash of an eye. Here's just one for your interest. This is an organism called hallucinogenia, believe it or not. And here it is. Here is its actual fossil there, and it's basically a carbonized imprint of the organism there. This is, I think they just did an inversion of there, or maybe just. But here's a reconstruction. Here's a reconstruction of a totally bizarre looking form, unclear exactly what it is. Some people think it was a primitive arthropod. Other people say no, it's not. It's actually an echinoderm related to the sea cucumbers. It's very unclear because it's such a bizarre kind of form, and it's not alone. And if you look at this Cambrian period, it looks like there are all sorts of evolutionary experiments, and only a few of the lines actually survived. But those that did survive became fabulously successful. And we see from here on, we see a very rich fossil record as these different animal and plant groups evolve and become incorporated into the fossil record. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there for today, and I will do another recorded class for Friday, and then hopefully see you on Monday. Okay, and my voice is about to die. Okay, thank you very much.